Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the latest installment of Ripped from the Headlines. This morning, we will be covering to wear or not to wear the yarmulke, to wear or when to remove the yarmulke, and we'll be covering the subject of the yarmulke, the kippah, the beanie, and we know that a kippah, the Hebrew word, is something that we're familiar with in terms of being a cover. Right? Anyone familiar with another a prominent way that kippah is used to describe something other than a head covering? They talk about the kippah of the mosque. When you go to Jerusalem, you see the golden mosque of the golden dome of the Dome of the Rock or the mosque. That's also called a kippah. It's a cover. It's a roof. It goes on the top. But it's also called the yarmulke. And does anyone know why it's called the yarmulke? Where does it come from? Where does the name come from? Right? They don't talk about yarmulkes in the Talmud. They don't talk about knit yarmulkes or crocheted yarmulkes or velvet yarmulkes in the yarmulke. They talk about kisui rosh, covering.
Yarmulka.
Very good. Someone did their homework. Did you read Dan Rabinowitz's article on Hakira?
No, I sort of knew that one.
All right. I'll see. So you could have written the article in Hakira.
Well, let's not go too far.
All right. So there is an idea that it comes from the combination of the words Yireh Malka, Yireh Malka, fear of the king, the Aramaic form, right? Malka, you're thinking is queen, but Yireh Malka, both words spelled with an aleph, can be the fear of the king. So it means having that type of respect or reverence. There's actually a Turkish word, and this is in Dan Rabinowitz's article in the Hakira Journal, where he talks about some aspects of the head covering. There's a Turkish word that's sort of pronounced yamurluk. It means rainwear, so something that you wear outside. It could also refer to two Turkish words, yarim and kap. Yarim is half, and kap, head, hat. So it's a small hat. All sorts of fun stuff we can have in terms of finding the origins of what of yarmulke or head covering, but we know that as Tevye says, we wear the covering on our head. We are very familiar with the fact that it has to do with having reverence or being aware of what's above our heads. All this is true, but we're going to tackle this through the prism of something that came up a couple of weeks ago. You probably followed the news that there was a source number one has some of the details. A U.S. Congress mandated group cut short a fact-finding mission to Saudi Arabia after officials in the kingdom ordered the Jewish rabbi to remove his kippah in public, highlighting the religious tensions still present in the wider Middle East. About a third of the way through the village, a Saudi official handed a phone to Rabbi Abraham Cooper of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, on which an official told him to remove his kippah, skull cap worn by some Jews, also known in Yiddish as the yarmulke. Cooper refused, and the rest of the group agreed to cut short their visit over the demand. So this was the case, and obviously the rabbi wearing a yarmulke. Rabbi told to remove his yarmulke, decided this was an offense, and decided to cut short the trip, and the like. And we are familiar historically, culturally, in terms of the wearing of the kippah, wearing it publicly. There was a time, certainly you go back some 75 years, 80 years, 30s, 40s, 50s, the expression was coined by Rabbi Joseph Lookstein of the Ramah School back in that era, that the yarmulke is an indoor garment. Not that you should walk bareheaded outside, but you wear a hat outside, because everyone wore a hat outside. Right back then, everyone wore hats. But the yarmulke has, there was a time that it was viewed as very particularistic. Some of the Reform congregations here in the United States, also going back to that era, 100 years, 75 years, when you went into the shul, you were asked to remove your yarmulke because, the idea was to sit bareheaded in a house of worship was taken from the non-Jewish world. So, it's clearly a particularistic symbol, and there's some, emotion to it, and there's some soul to it. And nowadays, the variety that is worn can sometimes add some personality to it. But let's try and look at some of the sources that produce our yarmulke, and also even the idea of taking it off when society or otherwise demands, right? And we can touch upon it. Some of you may be referencing or thinking about Rabbi J.J. Schachter wrote an article probably some 25 years ago, about historically speaking, there were sometimes passport pictures of rabbis that were taken, and that when they were publicized later to the communities, they were photoshopped to have a yarmulke on top. Because very often, and some of you may have experienced this, if you're wearing a yarmulke and they want to take your passport picture, they ask you to take off your yarmulke because they have to get the pristine picture. And if you push back, they say, well, you can't take the picture. And, I would imagine certainly some of these pictures of rabbis from, early Soviet Russia 100 years ago, they weren't going to take we weren't going to take no for an answer. So they took them off. And, what is the religious reaction to this? Obviously, if you're in danger, we can appreciate it, that you do what you need to do. Or sometimes when there's more tension, we know there are many people in the aftermath of October 7th wanted to show their yarmulkes, to show Jewish pride. How does it, do we have some sort of precedence or some religious guidance on the subject? So with that, by way of introduction, and that was the case, we saw Rabbi Cooper obviously did not want to take off his kippah, especially representing a commission on religious freedom. Religious freedom is not the time to be coerced to do religion differently. Let's look at a couple of sources, and there are a number of sources in the Talmud that talk about kisui rosh, covering of the head. So one is Kedushin 31a. Rav Huna, son of Rav Yehoshua, would not walk 4 cubits with an uncovered head. He said, the divine presence is above my head, and I must act respectfully. All right, so he would always walk with his head covered. Shabbat 118b, Rav Huna, son of Rav Yehoshua. Again, Rav Huna, giving us some head covering guidance. May I receive my reward because I never walked 4 cubits with my head uncovered. He was proud of the fact that he would always cover his head in a symbol of propriety. Now, what's missing? What word is missing from Rav Huna, his declarations? There's no obligation. He doesn't say you must cover your head. It's descriptive, and he's saying there's reward. It doesn't say anything about legality. The Kolbo, right, coming into the late Middle Ages, it is not prohibited to walk with an uncovered head. Right, and Rav Huna brought the Rav Yeshua's statement, "May reward come my way for never having gone 4 cubits with my head uncovered," is a matter of pious conduct. Right, so the Rishonim, the early authorities, were sensitive to this idea. We know that there's an idea of covering the head. We know that Rav Huna was a big proponent. We know there are other sources that encourage it, but no one ever says you have to. Now, again, just because no one ever says you have to doesn't mean it's not a good idea or there becomes a religious responsibility to do so. But from the sources, and early on, there was the sense that you don't have to. Now, as time goes forward, and I guess there's more time to digest some of the Talmudic sentiment, as well as the Jewish diasporic community changes and shifts. This idea of a yarmulke, a head covering, in a regular way, is embraced. And just if we fast forward, we know that there's some communities that are more inclined to require this more often. We know, for example, culturally speaking, we'll come back to this later, that in the Sephardic community, it's less something to be done. Generally, it's always done religiously. The Ashkenaz community, went not only from a head covering, but to a double head covering and wearing black hats and the like. But we see this idea, the head covering is a nice idea, it's a good idea, but as we go forward and the Jews encounter different cultures and live in different civilizations, Rav Huna's behavior seems to be something that we want to encourage to be emulated, and adding a requirement to cover the head. So, for example, when we go a little bit further to the Mahari Brona in the next source, we encounter, we're talking about a 15th century Central European rabbi collecting Ashkenazic practice. So the Mahari Brona says, source number 5, the implication of the Gemara that head covering is not strictly required is only true for them, for the rabbis, for the Jews in Israel, because the Jews there would go about this way bareheaded. That was the way they were doing it. And Rav Huna decided to counterculturally cover his head. But we who live among the nations, and they go about bareheaded, this is considered the traditions of the nations, and there's no point of distinction between us and them except for head covering. Then going bareheaded is currently considered a violation of the precept of Judaism over al dat Yehudit, right? It's one thing where the Jews are not wearing head coverings, and you want to be pious and wear a head covering. And in that case, the default setting is there's no obligation. But once Jews are living among non-Jews, and the non-Jews, their shita, their approach, their comportment is to go about bareheaded, well, then that becomes a non-Jewish practice. And for us to follow in that practice is problematic. And we are considered as violating what should be an accepted norm. And then, to add to this, the Mari Bruna compares this to the situation in Ketubot, with a woman who goes out with her head uncovered is considered to be violating the precepts. He compares it to the discussion that we have with married women covering their hair, which is a larger halachic topic. But one of the approaches to the married women covering their hair is that married women have to cover their hair because that's the way society goes about doing it. And so society does it and married women don't do it, then they're violating a societal norm. And, so you could say maybe that was then, that times have changed, and these are all parts of the halachic discussion with regards to the kisui rosh for married women covering their hair. But the Mari Bruna sees that there's something similar. Nowadays, since the non-Jewish approach is to go bareheaded, the Jews have to differentiate themselves, and therefore Jews covering their heads has become the accepted Jewish practice. A Jew to go around bareheaded is violating that established Jewish practice. So it's kind of interesting that if you combine the cultures together, the man and the woman, if the Jewish man and the Jewish married woman, if they're both uncovering their hair, they're in the same boat technically, because they're both violating a societal norm, and that's the way the Mari Bruna understands it. So the idea of we go further, and this is again Central Europe, Moravia area. The idea we've gone forward from this being just a nice idea to this really having morphed into a societal religious obligation. Questions, comments, or reactions?
What about the song Iremato Wumanahayim? Is that related to what you're talking about? You familiar
in terms
with
of what? Jews getting along? We should still be able to get along. And I would say that what probably has changed, and we'll come to this in terms of where society is in terms of these days, there was a culture going back to the 40s, 50s in America for men to cover their heads outside. They wear hats, right? You look at the baseball games of the images they have, everyone's wearing a hat. It was kind of viewed as scandalous when JFK, when he was inaugurated, didn't wear a hat. So, cultures change. And so that does impact some of the discussion with regards to the Dat Yehudit component of married women covering their hair, and will certainly influence, the discussion of Kisui Rosh for men. But we do see Mari Bruna seem to say that it can rise to a higher level of obligation.
So if we want to distinguish ourselves, why do we draw the line at wearing a yarmulke? Why don't we all wear shtreimel and
some people, some have gone in that direction last I checked.
So I've heard. And when did you say the Mari Bruna lived?
He's living in the 15th century.
15th century, okay.
Definitely with a Christian influence. So now, while that lane is being followed, you had those who felt that maybe it's different. Maybe it's maybe some would say this is cultural. Some would say that it also there's a distinction between public and private. Right? Some think that you have to always cover your head if you're doing something Jewish. Right? You're saying a bracha, put a yarmulke on. We see that the Mari Bruna's cultural direction of making this a religious responsibility, not just a good idea or a midat chasidut. Rabbi Shlomo Luria, when discussing this, right, he's writing later in the 17th century, but he says, I heard about a certain chacham that when he would learn bareheaded. And he said that the burden of a head covering was heavy upon him. It wasn't comfortable for him to wear his yarmulke. Remember, we're talking about a scholar who's private, so it's not necessarily being noticed, but engaged in religious activity. So we see that the Mari Bruna's approach may have shaped the public behavior, but certain things still seem to emerge. That there are those who feel that religious activity does not require a kippah or a yarmulke, as well as it's not kind of it certainly indoors doesn't require the same head covering. So as this is presented in the Shulchan Aruch, let's see how halacha lamasa it makes its way into the Code of Jewish Law, source number 7. It is forbidden to walk in an overly upright posture. Right, this is one of the other things mentioned in that same Gemara, and one should not walk a distance of 4 amma with the head uncovered. And then one should examine one's orifices to ensure they're all kept clean. This is all the idea of having a proper posture and a proper cleanliness and a proper sanctity to be involved in holy activities. Right, the orifice, the Hebrew word is nikavim, which is from the Asher Yatzar blessing that we say, being grateful that our bodily functions operate. So again, but the Shulchan Aruch says one should not walk a distance of 4 amma with the head uncovered. What doesn't it say? It doesn't say you have to wear yarmulke every time you go outside. It doesn't say you have to wear yarmulke when you say holy words or involve religious behavior. It says when you're walking, you have to 4 amot. You have to wear walking 4 amot. You have to have one should not walk a distance 4 amma with the head uncovered. So, right, there's obviously a lot of discussion, a lot of commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. We take this to the Mishnah Berurah. Mishnah Berurah, Rabbi Yisrael Kagan, the Chafetz Chaim, has collected a lot of this back and forth in halachic discussion. So he's writing what he feels is the appropriate path to follow right at the turn of the 20th century, source number 8. The pious trait is not to remove a yarmulke even less than 4 cubits, and to do so even when sleeping at night. Right, so he's now, expanding the scope of the when and to wear the yarmulke, and for how often to wear the yarmulke, and even if you're doing nothing to wear the yarmulke. There are those who lean towards saying that moving even 4 cubits without a yarmulke isn't prohibited according to Jewish law, except for those who are modest in their ways. Right, now he acknowledges that what we've seen before, that not everyone feels that this is an obligation. However, and he quotes the Taz, a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch from the 18th century, has already written that in our time it is entirely prohibited, according to Jewish law, to have one's head uncovered, even when sitting in his house. So the Mishnah Berurah is embracing the view that sees this as an absolute obligation, and that school of thought, as opposed to the way the opinion that Rabbi Shlomo Luria quoted, and we'll see others also disagree. But for the Mishnah Berurah, this is the behavior. This has now gone from aspirational behavior, pious behavior, to obligation. And also that regarding covering heads, it's enough to cover one's hand with cover one's head with a hand. You just go like this. And similarly, if one is checking their head for lice, it's prohibited to not cover one's head. You see, you don't always have to cover your head. If you have to check your head for lice, you can take your yarmulke off. There's a Rabbi Yosef Rosen, known as the Rugged Shover, who was known for having a very wild head of hair. And one of the explanations is given, he said he never wanted to take his yarmulke off to get a haircut. So he was, because he was always thinking Torah. He had embraced this type of view, so the yarmulke can never come off. Hopefully, I guess he didn't check for lice either. And see further, the Pri Megadim, who wrote that moving 4 cubits in the open air, covering one's head with a hand, is not sufficient. The idea that going like this is okay if you're inside, but not if you're outside. Right? The idea that so the requirement has been taken, has been more concretized. Is now considered more of an absolute obligation. You always have to have the yarmulke on the head, even when doing nothing, even when inside. Maybe this is enough inside. Definitely not enough outside. We've added some layers to the cover. Again, that's how the Mishnah Berurah filters the view of the Shulchan Aruch and the commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch. The Vilna Gaon, whose commentary on Shulchan Aruch is not always that long and effusive. The Vilna Gaon very often would just write a couple of sources as his commentary on the Code of Jewish Law. Here, the Vilna Gaon has a larger exposition about this subject, and says, Klala de Milsa, the bottom line of how he concludes the discussion, Ein isur klal barosh megula liolam rak lifnei hagadolim. He said there's absolutely no prohibition for an uncovered head. Really, it's only the pious ones who have an extra responsibility to cover their head. Now, if you want to be pious, you'll wear one too. V'chein be'es hatfila, and the same thing is true during davening. There's no prohibition to pray with an uncovered head. As nachon hadavar mitzad hamusar, it's correct. It's appropriate behavior. It's helpful for instruction. Ushar hayom l'kedusha she'omdim lifnei Hashem tamid, and also for those who want to aspire to live godly lives as if they're standing before Hashem always, it's the right thing to do. So, a couple of things emerge from the Vilna Gaon. Now, some people point to the fact that, look, see, there's no prohibition, so you can always uncover your head. You can daven with the head uncovered, and it's not required at all. However, he does conclude by saying it's appropriate instruction. It sets the right tone. But I think it also highlights the fact that, within the rabbinic community, there was an awareness that you had, the haves and the have-nots, those who had a more spiritual sensitivity, and there are plenty of people who don't have that spiritual sensitivity. And the Vilna Gaon was writing from a very high spiritual level, in his circle, and recognizing that everybody else was somewhere different in their spiritual attainments or their spiritual approach to life. If you look into the Mishnah Berurah put it all together. Mishnah Berurah kind of expects everyone to follow or aspire for something more, and therefore, what the Vilna Gaon views as aspirational behavior, the Mishnah Berurah views as required behavior. And but the Vilna Gaon, concludes from a halachic perspective, no requirement, inside, outside, prayer, no prayer. An uncovered head is permissible. The Talmud gave the example of someone that was his practice, but the halachic practice is impacted by where the Jews are, when the Jews are, what the types of the educations are necessary to ensure proper behavior. And we can appreciate that things are not always as black and white as the Vilna Gaon wants it to be. And the Mishnah Berurah is writing for a more complex reality. And Rav Ovadia Yosef, I think, captures some of the shift in how essential a head covering has turned into Jewish identity. It's a marker. I have a friend, Rabbi David Aaron from Oraita, from Israelite, who says that the yarmulke is the bullseye, so God knows how to get us. That's girls are at a spiritually higher level. God's not in to zap them like He is us, but it's clear that it's taken on a kind of a different, emotionally different type of status. And Rav Ovadia Yosef, on the Sephardic side, and so who we'd expect to have a more, amcha, people, you don't have to wear it as much. Why does it have to become so strict? He has another rationale for what has shifted, and I think it makes a lot of sense in terms of culturally describing the role of the yarmulke, kind of somewhere maybe in between the Mishnah Berurah and the Vilna Gaon. Vilna Gaon, it's not halachic at all, and only the elite have to wear it. And the Mishnah Berurah saying, no, everybody has to wear it. Rabbi Yosef says, source number 10, one who walks bareheaded, on the contrary, this entails an appearance of prohibition. Marit ayin. They will suspect that he's a secular person who casts off the yoke of the kingdom of heaven from upon himself. He doesn't say you have to wear a yarmulke. He doesn't say it has something to do with being not Jewish. He says that the Jewish world, the late 20th century, yarmulke show tradition, and not wearing a yarmulke shows you not as traditional. Again, is it about all the time? Is it about having one available? You have some people who don't wear one, but when they encounter another Jew, they take it out of their pocket, put it on, or however you want to define when they're going to wear it. But it's turned into kind of a marker as to whether someone is more traditional, and certainly the different varieties have indicated that. There are first off, many of us are probably familiar with growing up with a synagogue that had a bin in the front door with yarmulkes. First off, in today's Orthodox community, modern Orthodox community, you don't have as many bins anymore because the expectation is people who are coming to shul bring their own yarmulkes. And what's also interesting is those congregations, the congregations that I've davened in or served in my experience, have always had the bin. What kind of yarmulkes do they have? They had like those satin ones, the big ones, the parachutes. And I still remember as a kid, when you get to shul on the high holidays, you see a lot of those. That's when you have to make sure you have them on hand because a lot of the Jews who are coming less often, 3 times a year Jews they call it, they're the ones grabbing the parachutes. Now, it doesn't have to be. It's people can forget them and then they have to wear it also. I think culturally speaking, in the Sephardic community where people have them on their person less often, if they're not coming to shul, if they enter into kind of a Jewish event, they come to a school for a parent-teacher event, and they're more likely to have the parachute on or take the one from the bin. But it's just kind of interesting how that has developed. It was also interesting that at KJ, until the, I guess, 60s or 70s, everyone was expected to wear the same yarmulke. So everyone was expected to wear the parachute. And sometimes you'd be tapped on the shoulder and say, "Excuse me, sir, please remove your skull cap for one of the ones that the congregation is wearing." That's kind of like the great equalizer, maybe. And so now, it's kind of, along the lines of what Rabbi Ovadia Yosef is saying. It's kind of, you sometimes, maybe you shouldn't. Don't judge a book by its cover. Don't judge a person by their yarmulke. But you're probably thinking something when they see their yarmulke, because it's become kind of an indicator or delivering a message in this type of a situation. Questions or comments? Because we're going to look at now kind of what about the instruction to remove? How is that viewed when the Gentile tells the Jew to not do something that they're supposed to do?
Rabbi.
Yeah.
No, today it's even more so what you just ended with. Certain yarmulkes indicate a certain belief or what you follow, like the velvet or the knitted one. They all mean something. You can
or you put
differentiate.
or you put Yankees or Mets on it.
Right. Well, that
of
course that just encourages kids to wear them, I guess. Is there any connection with the Catholic leaders that cover their head, cardinals, bishops, the Pope? Is there any connection to yarmulkes?
So I'm not fluent in their practices. There's clearly an element of head covering that goes into their religious behavior. What we're going to see in terms of, we do see that the fact that non-Jewish society or Christian society was going bareheaded did seem to influence the Mahari Bruna, so to up the ante for us to wear it. But I don't think we're necessarily paralleling, or driven by the way they do it. But I do think there's probably, the idea of head covering is respect.
Okay.
Yeah, Phyllis.
I may be going a little off topic, but I recall years ago when married women would come into synagogue, if they didn't have a hat or, they weren't wearing the synagogue. I went to Judea Center in Brooklyn on Bedford Avenue. There's certainly, I don't remember anyone wearing a sheitel, but I remember women taking a kippah and putting it on their head.
I think that's usually when they ran out of doilies.
I don't remember doilies. I just remember
always doilies. Doilies have a long history.
Of course, I was a young girl, but still.
That's right. You're too young to remember doilies. But no. But look, the idea. Some congregations instituted the idea of men and women should cover their head in the sanctuary. It was kind of a respect, and it wasn't, without going through the halachic analysis of either the yarmulkes or the married women covering their head. The idea was cover the head. So there would be yarmulkes for the men and doilies for the women. But if they ran out of doilies, then they would, then women who had been reared with this, formality and tradition and, certain behavior for the synagogue would do it. I'm not so sure it necessarily has religious or halachic significance. Obviously, married women covering their hair is something that's discussed. That's part of, halacha. So those who were not wearing hats when they came to shul to put on a doily might be a replacement. But I think for the most part, the congregations that did it were doing it more for, more of a decorum and more of a uniform issue rather than halachic. It was kind of the sanctity of the synagogue, and again, developing in a time when things were more formal in general. I do remember that the maintenance team would call them the lady kippahs. They were not as familiar with the term doily. Carla, you have your hand up. You have to just unmute.
I heard, I'm old, but not that old. Probably am, but didn't
How
know.
old? No, I'm kidding.
How old are you? Are you one? Are you two? That the reform movement 100 years ago, 80 years ago, demanded that you remove
Yep.
a head covering,
Yeah. We briefly alluded to that.
even a hat. I mean,
Correct.
people wore
Correct.
hats and
Correct.
not kippas necessarily. I think also, I mean, when did it, where in centuries ago they talked about head covering wasn't necessarily a kippah or a yarmulke. We don't know exactly what the head covering was, right? 500
Well,
years
I
ago.
think we kind of do know it was a head covering. It was, what were head coverings? They were pieces of material that you put on your head.
But
you know.
not a well-formed beanie, right?
I would imagine, like with the cavemen, it started with a piece of material, and someone's like, "Why does it have to look so ragged?" And they trimmed it, and then why do we, add some color or add some, then we can start mass producing them. And I think that for the most part, the idea of a covering was accepted. But you're right, the Reform community was a more sense of decorum. However, it seems to go very much against what Reform Judaism claims to be about. Reform Judaism is about choice. And here they are demanding you take off your yarmulke.
But
And if
not,
anything, you should
but
be
I
given a
think,
choice.
but I think they have added it back. It is optional now because I think they realized when you got rid of everything Jewish.
Okay. Well, look.
Wasn't so good.
For that's an interesting conversation, and probably along the right path in terms of Jewish continuity in general.
Right.
But I do think that that connects a little bit to I think the psychology of Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, right? The idea that these days, fluency and familiarity with the yarmulke seems to indicate that a person is more traditional.
Correct.
If you're wearing the parachute, hanging off your head, you clearly are not used to wearing a yarmulke that often, right? There's that book, the synagogue, the survival guide for the synagogue. I think they have one for the high holidays, and Shimon Appersdorf, I think, is the author, and the cover is a picture, of someone who's like tallis is falling off and their yarmulke is falling off, and just there's a certain, it symbolizes or seems to demonstrate something, and Marat Ayin. He invokes that, we might think, the wrong thing about the person.
Well, at Sheretz Israel, my city synagogue, you were not allowed to wear a kippah. You had to wear a hat.
Okay.
And those who came in with kippot were sat in the back rows. They were asked not to sit up front. And for years and years, all the men wore hats, straw hats in summer after Memorial Day. Now they all wear kippot.
Well, we see how how sartorial expectations can be influenced by religious behavior or possibly religious obligation.
Right.
So, with regards to being demanded, being told to take off a yarmulke, so there seems to be a discussion of Jewish encounters with Christian clerics. For centuries, from the Middle Ages in Germany, 12th century. Look, the Jews encountered Christians, the entire time their experience in the Middle Ages in Europe. But in particular, there goes all the way back to the 11th century, discussions among rabbinic voices as to what to do. And the Darkei Moshe, source number 11, is the commentary of Rabbi Moshe Isserlis, right? So Krakow, 1500s. Goes back and traces some of the discussion going back to the Trumat Hadeshen, who we quoted before. We're going to quote next again, this discussion of Otan Komrim Osarim. Right, they used to have, nobles or priests. Sheyesh Lem Demus Elil B'Begadim O B'Kovaim. They had a cross, or they had an idol, or looked like an idol on their clothes or on their hats. Yiret tov li zaher limnoa b'chol hayichol lishtachavot negdam v'ki agavna d'shachavaya hu min avoda shechayim aleim karet b'chol elil sheba'olam. He says that, look, if you have to be careful not to bow in front of them, because you should li zaher tov li zaher, careful. You don't want to be bowing before them because they're wearing a cross, an idol, and they're bowing to that cross or idol, and that's considered idolatry. right? We're not so far away from which holiday where this is invoked midrashically as the problem.
With Purim, with
Purim.
Mordecai bowing to Haman.
Right? Why
They said
wouldn't
he had
Mordecai
a-
just bow down to Haman?
He had
Because
he had a
he had an idol on his around his neck.
vessel on his, yeah.
Right? If they throw money down in front of him, which is another midrash with the story of Yehudit and Hanukkah. Right? Her seven sons, and they took the youngest son, they put some coins down, said, pick up the coins. It's a trick to get you to bow down in front of the idol. Then he quotes Rabbi Oppenheim. He said, you're allowed to stand before them to honor them. Vilasur kovam mipnehem, but to take your hat off in front of them to show respect. But maybe close your eyes. Or if they're coming, stand up before they get there, so you're not directly honoring them and their religion. But we see here a discussion or a precedent of a precedent of removing the hat in honor of the non-Jewish official. So that's what the Darchei Moshe quotes. Then Harich Sham Bazeh Katzarti. That's written. There's more that's written there. I've written it shorter. It seems that Kasav Rav Yitzchak Oppenheim, Kasav Hatam Holavagam Hanachrim Eina Noagin LaHasir Kovev Nehadmus, because when the non-Jew is taking off their hat, that's not a form of worship. That's just a form of respect. You're not necessarily doing anything problematic as a sign of respect. But we see here at least an expectation of a hat removal for a non-Jewish official. We see that is technically permissible. It's not a sin or a violation of idolatry. Trumat Hadeshen, I do not really know, source number 12, an explicit prohibition against uttering the name explicitly and with uncovered head for the sake of mandated oaths, dealing with a situation where you have to take a vow and you're in the court and you have to take an oath bareheaded, and they have the Jew swear with Hashem's name, right? Because we're not going to swear by their God. This is not an utterance in vain. You're allowed to do that because it's necessary in order to comply with the law against believing their oaths, right? You have to swear using Shem Hashem, God's name in this case. So you have to swear with Hashem's name, and you have to uncover your head, right? With regard to uncovering the head, we do not find any explicit prohibition against this. So, the idea of this ties a little bit to what we were discussing before. There's no prohibition against an uncovered head invoking God's name, but if it's necessary for the court to appear before the non-Jewish court, you can do so, and you can even say God's name or pronounce God's name with the head uncovered. Source number 13, that we see, remember, Trumat Hadeshen is writing, 1300s. We're going through the Middle Ages. There's probably a little bit more oppression on the part of the the Jews don't have much influence, right? So by the time you get to closer to the modern era, right? Yaakov Breischer is writing in the he's writing late 17th, 18th century. By the time you get there, you see that there's just like there has been a hardening of the view as to wearing the yarmulke, like we saw the Mishnah Berurah from the Shulchan Aruch to the Taz into the 20th century. As you move from the 14th into the 17th, 18th century, there's a little bit of a hardening in our desire not to take off the yarmulke when told to do so. Rabbi Yaakov Reisher, source 13. Nevertheless, it's possible to excuse ourselves by saying that we have a great prohibition against being bareheaded in a shul. Perhaps this will mollify him. Maybe you should try and explain that I can't take off my yarmulke. Certainly those who do so will be remembered for good. It's a nice idea to try to avoid taking off your yarmulke. Right? So, we have the permission, but we still don't want this to be, we don't want you to think that this is what you could or should do. And going further into the 19th century, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Ullman, also along this path, and thus it is a grave sin, chas v'shalom, that is too great to be borne to sit bareheaded in the community meeting place and deal with public affairs, except for a situation where it's the law of the land, that a picture of the Kaiser or king is placed on the wall. It's a matter of his honor to sit bareheaded before his picture, as is known, in which case is permitted as Dina de Malchusa Dina. Right? Again, let's, again, you have no choice, you have no choice, but let's not be so flexible here. Chas v'shalom, it's a grave sin. There's no obligation, but being bareheaded is a grave sin. So we see that that thrust that started in in the Middle Ages. We recognizing that, and it could be, certainly we're into here. Ullman is already into the 19th century, in the period of the Enlightenment, in a place where Jews and non-Jews are interacting more. You're allowed to if you have to, but let's not enjoy it. Let's recognize that there's still a great sin to be bareheaded. And the yarmulke, the head covering, should always be worn as much as humanly possible. That was one thrust. We see that at the same time period, another direction was being taken. And this is Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman, who's mentioning this, is mentioning the practice of Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, source number 15. In the holy community of the Yereim were those God-fearing Jews of Frankfurt am Main. Remember, Rabbi Hirsch, as we see, as engaged as he was with German culture, German language, German comportment, behavior, Torim derech eretz, he still was very conservative, small c, as it came for the Jewish community. And he separated his Orthodox community from the larger community, which was Orthodox and non-Orthodox. He felt that it's okay to engage with society, but the Jewish community has to be run completely and under halachic auspices. And when the general Frankfurt community would not agree to that, he split off and founded his own community of what was called the Yereim. So the holy community of the Yereim of Frankfurt am Main, the school that was established by the Gaon Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, which I was a teacher for 2.5 years. The students sit bareheaded during secular studies, and only during the study of Torah do they cover their heads. And this is the custom of the school of Hamburg as well. This was done there in accordance with the edict of Rabbi Hirsch. First time I arrived at the home of Rabbi Hirsch with a hat on my head, he said to me that here it is derech eretz, appropriate to remove the hat from one's head when one visits an important person. And perhaps another teacher, many non-Jewish teachers in the school, who will see that I'm not removing my hat in the presence of the head of the school, the director, will consider this as though I'm insulting him. In this and similar context, there's no issue following in the ways of the non-Jews. Rabbi Hirsch expected people who visited him to take their hats off in the educational, in the school setting, so that the non-Jews would not think that anyone is insulting the director of the school. So we see in another direction, one could see, one could appreciate how the Rabbi Hirsch direction is a little bit more of a slippery slope. You take your hat off when you see the director of the school, but you put your hat on when you visit the rabbi. It happens to be the same person. So it's there's a little bit of slippery slope, which we can appreciate, can leading to falling. But we do see that as we start, it's pious behavior. It's not a requirement. It's not an absolute obligation at all, says the Vilna Gaon. Taking it off when there's an expectation to is permissible. So you want to try and protect against any dilution of the identity or the expectation, or are you willing to go along with the flow? Difference between Rabbi Ullman and Rabbi Hirsch. Also, to note, and this is something that was mentioned, I referenced an article by Dan Rabinowitz in Chakira about the Yarmulke. He also quotes this Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman's response. Points out that some of the comments that are more open to things being uncovered have been censored or later editions not printed and the like, because it shows that it's not just one monolithic stringent way of looking at things. There's alternatives as well. So the idea of the Yarmulke certainly has a long and storied history, but it has us encounter both in terms of our encounter with God, but also our encounter with society around us. And I think it was an appropriate move that was taken to protest being told to take off the yarmulke, especially on a religious tolerance mission. And recognizing that in many ways that, I think what Rabbi Ovadia Yosef said about it representing a certain symbol of one's connection to tradition, is very telling. End of the day, whatever color yarmulke or type of yarmulke you wear or don't wear, a Jew is a Jew, invoking Al Marshak's Shevet Achim Gam Yachad. But we've looked at a little bit of the history and the thinking behind the Jewish head covering, the yarmulke.
Rabbi,